Hello and welcome. My name is David Saunders. I'm a curator at the Getty Villa in Los Angeles, home to the Getty's collection of ancient Greek, Roman, and Etruscan art. Before starting today, we would like to acknowledge that the land that the Getty inhabits today was once known as Tovangar, the home of the Gabrielino Tongva people. We show our respects to the Gabrielino Tongva people, as well as all First People, past, present, and future, and honor their labor as original caretakers of this land. The Getty commits to building relationships with the Gabrielino Tongva community, and we invite you to acknowledge the history of this land and join us in caring for it. Today's event complements an exhibition that recently opened here at the Getty Villa titled Picture Worlds, Greek, Maya, and Moche Pottery. Next slide, please. As you can see, this exhibition brings together the painted pottery of three distinct cultures, the Greeks, the Maya, and the Moche. And what we hope to do today is to provide you with a little insight into the exhibition and the project, and to pull out some threads for deeper exploration. Next slide, please. So as I say, the exhibition brings together the painted pottery of the Greeks between around 700 and 323 BCE, the Maya between around 550 and 850 CE, and the Moche in what is today northern Peru between around 200 and 850 CE. So these are three distinct cultures with very different ways of organizing society, different myths, different ritual practices, different belief systems, but they all produced an incredible array of painted pottery, vessels for feasting, for drinking, for gift giving, for ritual use, decorated with complex scenes of narrative, episodes involving heroes, gods, divinities, myths, ritual practices. And the exhibition brings these three distinct cultures together to really explore what these painted pots made possible. We will do that in our session today, focusing on three vessels, and I'm delighted to be joined by two colleagues who have been instrumental as this exhibition project has evolved. I'm delighted to welcome first Alice de Carteret, Assistant Curator of Art of the Ancient Americas at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Alice is an anthropologist with training in the art, archaeology, ethnohistory, and oral history of the indigenous peoples of Mesoamerica. And with Diana Magaloni and Davide Domenici, she is a co-curator for the upcoming exhibition We Live in Painting, The Nature of Color in Mesoamerican Art, which opens at LACMA this September. And secondly, Jeffrey Quilter, who amongst many distinguished titles served as Director of Pre-Columbian Studies and Curator of the Pre-Columbian Collection at Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, D.C., and then Director of the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology at Harvard University. Jeffrey has authored 7 books and many articles, and now retired, he devotes his time to research and publishing the Moche of Peru's northern coast. So I'm thrilled to be joined by Jeff and Alice. What we're going to do in the next 45, 50 minutes or so is each of us is going to present a single vessel or a small cluster of vessels, talk about them, introduce them to all of you, go into some of the pictorial details and the broader cultural contexts in which these vessels were made, and then having presented these three, spend some time discussing amongst ourselves ideas, differences, opportunities for juxtaposition, similarities, and so forth. With that, it is a pleasure to get this session started and to begin first with Alice, if I could hand the microphone over to you.
Thank you so much, David. And really, I am also delighted to be here to introduce 2 vessels from this exhibition, one of which you see spinning on your screen here. The 2 vessels I'm talking about are from the same tradition within late classic Maya society, and they depict the same scene involving the maize deity, which is why I've selected to talk about them as a pair. But these vessels are part of a much larger tradition of narrative art in the classic Maya world, so I'm going to dive into that a little bit here. So if we could have the next slide, please. The late classic period is defined in classic Maya society by these distinctive ceramic styles associated with distinct polities across the landscape. And the map here highlights some of these styles and their approximate geographic locations, at least where these different works were produced. Where they might have ended up might be a little bit different. But as you can see here, the styles are defined by very different palettes of colors that they were able to engineer, different iconographic conventions as well. What might be less clear from the slide is that there's different content too. So some traditions focused really on historical narratives involving historical figures, others more supernatural in nature. And many of these vessels, as named by their inscriptions, are cups for various chocolate drinks, so that's what they were used for. And they were also likely used in gift giving amongst royals and nobles, though that varied by the style as well. So the Eek style, which you see here on the top left, they're found at many different sites across the region, not just where they were produced, so that indicates gift giving between polities, while the Codex style, which is what I'll be talking about today, are found principally at the sites where they were made. So there's more of an internal audience that we're thinking about here. If we could have the next slide. So like I mentioned, I'm talking about the Codex style in particular, and it's associated with a dynasty known as the Kanul dynasty, centered at the site of Calakmul and its affiliated political centers. It's made in a more narrow time frame from about 680 to 750 CE, and it's so named because of seeming similarities with the tradition of painting bark paper codices. So you have the white gessoed background with calligraphic black lines that define the imagery, but otherwise there's not a lot of content overlap between these two traditions. For the Codex style, the content is exclusively supernatural in nature. So we see otherworldly toads here. We see mythic creation scenes involving women enveloped in snakes. We see figures that are involved in creating visions through the burning of tobacco. So they're all kind of these supernatural primordial events, but that are linked in some cases with the historical or mytho-historical Kanul dynasty. So there's some sort of allegorical function to these vessels using the content in them to support dynastic legitimacy. And I'm going to talk about one particular scene within this style, and that's the water group, if I could have the next slide. So like I mentioned, we're going to dive into one recurring scene, the water group, which there are a couple dozen examples of this known to exist. The scene is super formulaic, and here we have two 3D models that are going to help us look at the iconography in relation to the shape of the vessel. There is one, well, there are many defining characteristics, but of them, maybe which is pretty noticeable, is that there's this brown wash that's in the bottom portion of the scene, out of which various figures emerge from the waist up. That's pretty unusual in my iconography to not depict a whole body, but depict one just from the waist up. The wash represents the primordial waters of the underworld, which is a supernatural setting often related to events before the rising of the first sun. The main personage, which is depicted in this particular angle of these 3D models, is the maize deity. So you see him here with a ponytail tied with a strip of jaguar hide. In one vessel, you see a water lily blossom emerging from his headdress, or you could see him adorned with jeweled headbands. These are all the attributes of someone with prestige and power. And on some of these vessels, the maize deity is actually swapped out with the mytho-historic founder of the Calakmul dynasty. So again, we see this connection between contemporary politics and primordial events. If we could go to the next slide. Ooh, so right behind the maize deity here, we have an attendant who holds a bundle. The bundle has usually, on many different vessels in the scene, but on the two depicted here, you can see for sure this plume of quetzal feathers. We have a mat, which is a symbol of rulership, a pair of ear spools atop, all adornments of someone with power and prestige. And the bundle itself is also labeled with the number 8,000. This is probably not a specific number, but is a quantity that's provided in order to convey something that there's a lot of, or some sort of wealth of something. So let's go back to the maize deity on the next slide. And we'll see here who he's pointing to, the person that they are confronting in this primordial underwater scene. Next slide. Here you see him confronting a warrior who's armed with a shield and a spear. He's got this musky stench associated with hunters, and that's shown by this dark scroll on the vessel on the right-hand side of the screen. And they're also wearing animalian headdresses adorned with quetzal plumes. These vessels just have one warrior, but other instances of the scene can have up to 3. We can have the next slide, please. On both of these vessels, there is an inscription that tells us that this warrior is no friend to the maize deity here. The inscription reads, on 3 Eek 15 Sak, which is a date, he entered the city Chak Shib, or invaded. And it appears that this person is an aspect of the rain deity Chak, who features in other parts of this mythic narrative. And this is the very standard formula of this particular scene of events. There's a maize deity, an attendant on the right-hand side, from our perspective, who faces these warriors on the left. And this formula is shared by almost all water group scenes with some rare exceptions, which we'll see on the next slide. This interesting exception here comes to us from the Dallas Museum of Art. It's the same water group scene, however, painted by a left-handed artist, which has mirror imaged, reversed everything happening. Not only the glyphs and the order that you read them, but the maize deity actually appears on the left-hand side and the warriors he confronts on the right-hand side. Next slide, please. And this particular scene is clearly part of a broader narrative, which is represented by other scenes on other vessels within this same tradition. This particular narrative pertains to the maize deity, his travails in the watery underworld, his then imprisonment and or death in this setting, and subsequent resurrection. These rollout images from Justin Kerr show other aspects of this scene. So on the top left-hand side, we see the maize deity in the same underworld water wash with female attendants, perhaps sirens that lead him to his imprisonment and death, but also his mourners. On the bottom left-hand side, we see his actual imprisonment. Underneath a masonry architectural structure, which is a symbol of the earth. The Chak, rain deity Chak, which is on the right-hand side of this particular image, uses his axe, an allegory for lightning, to break this earth or temple form into two. And the maize deity then emerges from this cleft, which you see on the right-hand side of the screen on this plate. The earth is now depicted as a turtle shell, and the maize deity emerges from this cleft to be nourished by the famed hero twins, who go on to become the sun in its daytime and nighttime aspects. So this whole story seems to be some sort of allegory for the cycles of agriculture, in which the rain and maize are really important parts. All right, next slide, please. So on their own, these vessels attest to the sophistication of classic Maya ceramic artists, but when we situate them in context, we can see how full their lives really are, emergent from the politics, culture, and moral structure of classic Maya society. Thank you very much for your time. I'll now hand it back over to David.
Thank you, Alice. I'm going to segue to one of the Greek vases in the exhibition. This is a large, about 50 centimeter high mixing bowl on loan to us from the Harvard Museums of Art. This was made in Athens around 480, 470 BCE. And this is a time when the Athenian pottery industry is booming. As we saw in the case of the Maya, pottery was produced throughout the Greek world too, but it's quite noticeable that Athens dominates the Greek market, particularly in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE. And they are producing pottery, painted pottery, not only for the domestic market in Athens and within Greece, but also making this for export as well. And we find Athenian vases all around the Mediterranean, and that will become important as we progress with this vessel. It is a large mixing bowl. The Greeks typically drank their wine diluted with water, and so they had a need for these large, capacious vessels such as this one, in which they could mix the wine with the water, which again will be relevant to what we talk about. And it's decorated in what we call today the red figure technique. So the figures are left the color of the clay, this distinctive orangey clay that is so recognizably Athenian, and the background is painted black. And then painters use a thin, very thin brush to delineate drapery folds, musculature, other details of the figures. Next slide, please. So looking closely at what is the front of this vessel, we have a mythical scene. At the center, the bearded figure you see is holding a trident in his left hand, which instantly identifies him as the god of the sea, Poseidon. And I think throughout Moche, Maya, and Greek art, we see this frequently, that figures are recognizable based on certain attributes and features that they either hold or wear. Theseus is shaking hands with his son, Poseidon is shaking hands with his son Theseus, who you see on the right, a young man with a wreath in his hair, a sword and its scabbard at his hip. And they are accompanied by a number of other figures. At the far right, the woman is probably Amphitrite, Poseidon's wife, and on the left, the elderly male with a balding head may be Nereus, who is another sea god, perhaps with one of his daughters at the far left, filling out the scene. So this is an episode in which Theseus shakes hands and greets his divine father, Poseidon, in contrast to the vessels that Elise showed. There is no explicit indication of the watery setting. There is no dilute paint to denote the sea. All we have is the representation of Poseidon, indicating that this is a maritime event. And similarly, the palace in which this takes place is rendered simply by just the single column that speaks for the entire building. This is a very suitable topic for a mixing bowl. These vessels for wine consumption were used at the symposium, where men would gather together, enjoy one another's company, sing songs, tell stories, play games, and the achievements and activities and activities and prestige of individual heroes was a key subject for conversation and discussion at a symposium. These were episodes that people knew, that people could talk about, and they could extol the virtues of, for example, Theseus. In this case, it's telling that on the other side of the pot, if we look at the next slide, there is actually a depiction of a lyre player being listened to by a group of three men. And this lyre player, he's holding a big wooden stringed instrument, and not only playing music, but most likely singing a song of some sorts. And we know that typically these songs were dedicated to the achievements and escapades of the various heroes that populated Greek myth. And so a subject like Theseus would be a very suitable subject for the lyre player's song, and in turn for people at a symposium encountering a vessel like this. So there is a very, I think, careful connection between the shape and the use of a vessel like this and the decorative subject. We can go a bit further, though. If we go to the next slide, back to the front, thinking about when this pot was made. This is the early 5th century BCE, and for many decades previously, Theseus had been a frequent figure in Greek vase painting, but almost always shown fighting the Minotaur. That was his most famous escapade and is the one that appears again and again and again. But towards the end of the 6th century BCE, around 520, 500, we see this explosion of other episodes involving Theseus, other battles that he fights, other episodes in his life, such as this one where he shakes hands with Poseidon. And it seems there is a really sort of new interest in telling stories about Theseus. And it's not unlikely that this has some connection with the establishment of democracy in Athens and the presentation of Theseus as the new sort of poster boy for the Athenian state. Theseus sort of represents everything that is virtuous and noble about Athenian masculinity. He is in many ways a new Heracles, and we see him in many scenes fighting opponents, undertaking various episodes and making the world safe for humankind. And this is represented not only in the pottery, but also we see it in what literature survives from the time and other archaeological evidence, sculpture, architectural decoration for temples and the like. There seems to be a real interest in Theseus at this time. Even more precisely, at around the time that the pot was made, 480, 470, Athens had just established a naval league to defend Greece. This is in the decades after the Persian invasions, this sort of momentous victory for the Greeks. They defeat the Persian invaders, and Athens establishes a maritime league and invites and encourages its allies either to pay money or to provide ships to defend Greece from further attacks. And it's not, I think, accidental that we see a scene like this, where Theseus, embodying all the virtues of Athens, shakes hands with the god of the sea. This is sort of essentially asserting Athens' very close connection with maritime events. It would be going perhaps too far to call this propaganda. We're not dealing with state-sanctioned media per se, but some of these images, such as this one, seem to tap into contemporary events. Or to put it another way, when we look at some of the myths and stories on Athenian vases that seem to be popular at certain times, it's worth thinking about the political and social contexts in which they were made. But, and just to finish off, this Athenian perspective isn't the only approach we can take to this vessel, because if we turn to the next slide, while we know it was made in Athens, We also know where it was discovered. It was found in a grave in Ruvo, which is ringed on the map in southeast Italy. So at some point in antiquity, this vase was exported from Athens across the sea to southern Italy, and it was deposited in a burial there. And it bears stressing the people at Ruvo were not Greek. They were one of the indigenous peoples in southern Italy, but at least in some parts of society, were very closely engaged with aspects of Greek culture. And that invites many questions about the scene on the vessel. To go to the final slide, seeing Theseus shaking hands with Poseidon, whether this sort of Athenian political context would have carried over as this vase was transported, or maybe it acquired a new meaning in this burial setting. And perhaps, just to throw out an idea, the representation of Theseus being greeted by a god would have provided consolation in the face of death, this idea of going into the unknown as Theseus descends into the waters and being welcomed by a god could have provided consolation and comfort to the deceased and their fellow mourners. With that, I'll pass over to Jeff.
Well, thank you, David. And I'm talking about the Moche, the third of our three cultures today and in the exhibit. And while all three of our disciplines started really to get going in the 19th century in a big way, Moche, or Mochica as it's also known, is perhaps lagging behind in some ways in terms of the amount of research that has been carried out on it compared to classical Greece and even the Maya. Nevertheless, we know a lot about the Moche, especially in the last 30 years. And nevertheless, it is also the case that we know them strictly through archaeology, with only a few hints from later times and writings that other people made, since the Moche had no writing. It is an archaeological culture, and as an archaeological culture, it's defined by a certain space, which is about 9 valleys or so that cut through the very dry desert of the north coast of Peru, and a time period about 250 to 850 or 300 to 950. We're not even entirely sure of the exact range of time. It's debated by a century or two in either way. But one thing that we all agree upon is that Moche had this very distinctive art style. And as we see here in this slide, it's represented by metallurgy, by ceramics, mural art, and many other crafts and art. May I have the next slide, please? Now, one of the iconic Moche vessels is this form that we see here in 2 different varieties, known as a stirrup spout bottle. And stirrup spout bottles had apparently very little utilitarian value. It's very hard to pour liquid in or out of them, as you can tell because of that shape. The shape of the handle is probably related to concepts of dualism, 2 things coming together to make one. But we do know through research that there are varying styles of Moche ceramics, and some of these are regional, some of these are temporal, and there seem to be 2 major divisions based upon space and time, with the earlier Moche era before about 650 CE, shown by the vessel on the left, in which figures were shown rather large scale with relatively a lot of space between them, versus the later time period in which the space is completely crowded with imagery, which seems to be a style that was more common on the north coast of the Moche region rather than the southern one. May we see the next slide, please? Now, in order to read Moche pots, we have developed this concept of a rollout, which we also saw in the Maya vessels. And here is one from the Getty exhibit, in which we have unwrapped this design that wraps around the vessel on the left. And it shows registers, presumably running up the vessel, since the action goes from left to right, and as it goes from left to right, it ascends to spiral to the top of the vessel. Nevertheless, we're not entirely sure if we should read it from the bottom up or the top down, although in general, we seem to favor from the bottom up because of that direction. One of the most unusual aspects of this vessel is what it shows. And it shows, echoing perhaps the other two cultures we've looked at and vessels, a maritime scene, because all of the imagery in all but the last bottom register show wave scrolls indicating a watery world of some sort. And in the two registers in the center of the vessel, we see images that are running, and some which are grabbing warriors who are tumbling as they are grabbed by the hair. And who is grabbing them are pieces of military uniforms, of warrior uniforms. For example, on the register from the second from the bottom, on the far left and in the middle, we have warrior helmet crests, which were part of the regalia of warriors. You can see at the very top, the figure sitting down holding the cup is wearing a black one. It's painted black hair for clarity on his head as he sits down. And the other items in his costume, such as the feathered bonnet behind him and the tailing feathers and the vestments, all of those are represented in the middle scenes by being shown as being animated, and they're attacking warriors. So what does this mean? Well, we have some ideas, partly by comparing this vessel with other ones. So may I have the next slide? This vessel on the left is an earlier Moche style, as you can see by the space between the figures and larger figures in general compared to the vessel surface. And again, we have a rollout on the upper right. And again, we have a watery scene. It's very hard to tell, but to me, it looks like the sea lions are chasing the fish rather than the fish chasing the sea lions, although maybe it's both. A world out of joint, a world in which objects which are supposed to be the servants of humans are changing the game and are attacking them, a revolt of the objects. And in this case, objects which are particularly associated with military themes. There are several vessels, only a few, very hard to locate them in terms of where they came from and their exact time periods. But this seems to have been a theme, a narrative that was told throughout the Moche realm on their pottery, but also on murals. The two photographs on the bottom are from one of the most important Moche temples in all of Moche land. And you can see them, they're fragmentary, but nonetheless, on the left, we have a prisoner who is being led by a rope, sort of like again, a helmet crest on the far left of the rollout, who's grabbing a seated prisoner by a rope around his neck. And on the right, we have a fallen instrument or object that seems to no longer be animated, a scene that is more fully explained in another vessel, which we'll see in the next slide. This is the most complex version of the revolt of the objects that we know about. It would take much too long to delve into the details here. But again, we have animated objects. If you look on the lower left of this scene, there's something like a sling that is animated. In this case, it's a full figure human with a sling combined, as if to make clear that this is an object which has come to life. And in the bottom register, the objects are winning. But if you look at the top, it's these dog warriors who are winning. So the tide has changed. And as the most complete narrative, it suggests that this period of instability that happened in mythic times was eventually reversed, in which humans came to reassert their dominance over their objects and things around them. And lastly, a key to all this is the fact that despite the situation in which we mostly have to rely upon archaeology, there is a myth that was recorded by Francisco de Avila, who was a missionary to the indigenous people of the highlands of Peru in the 17th century, who recorded a story that was told to him by villagers in a town called Huarochirí. And as part of this long narrative that he recorded, he states that there were a number of previous eras, very similar to the Maya, as we've heard today, but that in the last one, in ancient times, the sun died, and due to its death, there was a period for 5 days like nights, and when that happened, rocks banged against each other, grinding stones began to eat humans, male llamas began to raise people, and the world was out of joint. There was the revolt of the objects. And so this seems to suggest that this myth not only existed in the 17th century, but we have used it to interpret these ancient scenes. And luckily, we're glad that the world has stabilized again, just as we've learned from other scenes such as The Sorcerer's Apprentice and Hal in 2001, in which the world gets out of joint, objects revolt, but we'll try to reestablish order. Thank you very much. I send it back to David.
Thank you, Jeff. Plainly, we could spend all afternoon talking about each of these vessels. That is, to be honest, sort of the point. But in the interest of time, what we're going to do is segue to a short discussion amongst ourselves, trying to pull together some of the disparate threads that we've presented, and also give all of you watching time to submit your questions. And if you could do that in the Q&A field, we may not see them in the chat, so please use the Q&A, and we will try our very best to answer them. And again, all questions are welcome, either about specific objects or more broadly. But seeing, say, these three vessels and hearing you, Jeff and Alice, talk about them, you both touched upon this, but maybe we can discuss a little further. In the three societies that we're looking at, who would know these stories? Would it have been a select few? Was there sort of esoteric knowledge, or would they have been more broadly disseminated across the society?
Alice, do you want to go first?
Sure. So we know that these stories were most certainly circulating in kind of all levels of society, mostly because the ethnographic evidence that helps us interpret these vessels in the past are still record aspects of these stories surviving today for many indigenous communities across what we call Mesoamerica. So likely all levels of society would have been aware of the story of the maize god and his death and resurrection. That might have looked different in different areas, depending on where you were, but certainly they would have been aware of that. Now, would they have seen a vessel like this? Probably not. They were certainly circulating within more elite spheres. And so we have this kind of this disconnection between the oral history, the ethnohistory, the communities where we're getting the more fuller lived stories that we're using to interpret this evidence, but the evidence itself, archaeologically speaking, is coming mostly from elite aspects of society. So there might be some differences, but unfortunately, we don't have a lot of evidence for what the so-called commoners of classic Maya society would have been thinking with respect to these narratives. The evidence we have is coming from elite contexts produced for elite audiences by elite artists. But very likely they would have been known to different members of society.
Well, for the Moche, it's a little different because, again, we're not 100% certain, but Moche pottery seems to have been produced in quantity. There are thousands and thousands of vessels known in museums throughout the world. And they're commonly found in burials, although there's plenty of evidence to suggest that they were found outside of burials, that they weren't just used as funerary goods. They may have been included as funerary goods, but they weren't necessarily, they didn't start their lives that way. They may have even been something like souvenirs, that they were taken by pilgrims to major ceremonial centers where to bring home as a sign that they'd been someplace special. So the myth probably was fairly well known over a wide range of people. There were probably at least 2 or 3 classes of Moche folk in their day. The other thing that suggests that it was more widely known than we might think is the fact that when Francisco Avila went to Huarochirí in the 17th century, he was recording these stories from a group of poor farmers and herders who lived in a village, and they weren't elites at all. So it probably is a very ancient story. There's also a very similar story in Mesoamerica. So it seems to have been a very ancient story that really gets to, we like to talk about existential crises. Well, having your objects revolt against you certainly is an existential crisis. And it was something that worried the Moche.
Right, and in the case of the Greek material, I think these stories were I think can be confident in saying these stories were widely circulating, because in the case of the Greeks, we have a substantial body of literary evidence. One thinks of the plays of Euripides, Sophocles, and Aeschylus and Aristophanes, as well as monumental architecture in which these stories are being depicted. So this was very much part of the lived environment. This is in a way why the exhibition is titled Picture Worlds, because I think it's true for all 3 cultures. They lived within communities in which these representations were very tangible and present. Elise or Jeff, do you have any threads you wanted to? I have a long list of questions, but do you have any?
Well, I think one thing of interest is, although the stories might have been widely known, and I'll just use the Moche case, it's probably only a very few number of people who are allowed to go to the top of the temple top and enter that room where they could see this mural depicting it. So it's sort of like other religions where the stories are generally known, but nonetheless, there still may have been a hierarchy of esoteric knowledge among religious specialists that wasn't necessarily shared with commoners.
That, I suppose, feeds into another sort of idea I wanted to explore is I mean, we've titled this session POTS, Pictures, Politics, and Primordial Times. And, what is it about pottery that is so, well, is pottery effective for relating these stories? And if so, what is it about it that makes it such a dynamic medium in these 3 cultures?
Yeah, this is something that I find absolutely remarkable, at least across the Mayan and Greek instances, and I imagine this is true for the Moche too, that even if they're depicting really supernatural events, these stories, as you were mentioning, David, are really like tangible and connected to the lives that their producers were living, and that they would see, and it's kind of more widely known that for the Maya, time was not seen as this kind of linear, ever progressing thing, but something that was very cyclical. And so in these cycles of agriculture, in these cycles of deities and their stories, they saw themselves. And so the rulers themselves would be understanding the actions of contemporary politics or contemporary events within this kind of supernatural allegory. And maybe allegory is maybe too distant of a word for how they were imagining it, that these events were actually replaying themselves out in the geopolitical landscape in historic time. And I just find it really interesting that that ceramics are being used across these very different societies to do the same thing, to tell these stories and to connect and root what is a very supernatural event into something really historic and present and tangible.
Yeah, I think also, the ceramics they're relatively cheap. especially some of the lower end moche pots were done relatively quickly. And we have pretty good evidence that a lot of these were made in shops, that they were sort of cranked out in numbers. And the finer vessels that wind up in exhibits tend to be ones more carefully made, just like art today, just like ceramics today, in which there are world-class ceramicists who get to go to the exhibit things in the Getty, and then there are people who make pots and try and get their relatives to take them. The same thing was true in Moche times, in Maya times, and I am sure in Greek times too.
That sort of leads me maybe to ask, I mean, I think we've all touched upon it a little bit, but what do we know about the actual people making these things, their status, identity? In the case of the Greek vases, we know that some of them are signed, so we have names of potters and painters, and over many decades they have been studied closely, and even when they're not signed, we're able to attribute them to individual hands, so anonymous figures, but we're able to identify them sort of by their handwriting, if you will, and we can work out some of the social statuses. There's one Greek vase painter that signs explicitly as an enslaved person. Others may have been foreign immigrants. Others may have been citizens. So there's sort of a broad spread of makers. What about for the Maya and Moche?
I can say for the Maya that certainly the position of artist and scribe was a revered one, and it was somebody that held a lot of prestige within Maya society. We do have some artist signatures on ceramics, although they're relatively rare, which is another interesting thing. Why do signatures kind of crop up at certain times and not at others? And certainly for those cases, it does seem that that particular individual had a really well-respected, esteemed position in society. And even without the signatures, we know that artistry, that writing was seen as this kind of divine gift, and so those who were imbued with the ability to carry that out really had this cosmic power in their hands. That said, whoever was making the actual ceramic might not have been the same person that was painting it and adorning it with iconography. Most of the evidence we have from the Maya area suggests that the actual creation of ceramics is done by women. And most of the evidence we have for scribes suggests that the painters themselves were men. So you could imagine maybe a workshop that would have been that would have come together to actually produce an object like this. In terms of how many artists might have been working on a vessel like this, there's been a number of attempts to try to see how many hands were involved in the creation of the codex style. And there does seem to be a good, maybe few dozen different artists over the couple of generations that these were produced. And those are at least the people who are painting the scenes. Again, we don't know if they were also the ones making the vessels, or if it was kind of, as we have more evidence for, women who are actually the ones creating the shape and then having scribes paint them later.
For the Moche, we don't know many things, partly again because we don't have writing. This was not a society that had writing. We can identify different styles and hands, and Christopher Donnan, who is one of the leading scholars on Moche art, did a study working with Donna McClelland, who did the wonderful rollouts that we've been seeing today, and identified what appear to be workshops or schools of painting based upon, like Elise was saying, there are distinctive hands at work, and then there are styles that seem to cluster as similar approaches in the way things are being represented, so that we have been able to identify these different hands and styles. Part of the problem is locating where those were. It does seem to be that these big ceremonial centers were places where the finest pots were probably made. And as I alluded to before, there seems to be a gradation in quality, so that some of the very finest Moche vessels, such as the portrait heads that people may be aware of, which appear to represent distinct individuals and certainly look like portraits, those only come from the one valley and probably one site, and we're only made for a limited amount of time. So we're still trying to work out all these kinds of issues of schools of painting and how they relate regionally and throughout Moche land.
Thank you. I'm just looking at the time. Do either of you have burning issues that you'd like to bring up, or if not, we can maybe transition to the Q&A from our audiences.
The only point I had was I thought it was interesting, and I only realized it just before we went on the air today, is that all three of the scenes have to do with water and watery environments, which I thought was really interesting, that it just happened to be so.
And yeah, and I think thinking further about, I mean, actually one of our docents, I believe, asked the question of me as to kind of the recurrence of the spiral motif. And, you know, is there something that is universal? And I think, you know, these are cultures that have, you know, there are certain, I suppose, ways of visualizing waves that are, irrespective of time and place, are can be seen as consistent.
Mm-hmm.
Let's move to the Q&A. There are already I see a dozen or so questions already, lots of good things. Please, again, whilst we're discussing these, feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A feature. Let's have a look. Here's a good question. To what degree with narratives, especially those not supported by texts, do scholars come to agreement about educated guesses versus argue vigorously?
I think it's strongly in the argue vigorously camp. Yes, when I published an article called "The Moche Revolt of the Objects," early in my career, I think it was in 1990 or so, and there were was a lot of pushback from other scholars because you do have to make certain leaps of faith, especially again when we don't have text to rely upon as a foil for maybe correcting us in some of our, interpretations. But I'm pretty confident that the Revolt of the Objects was an idea, and that just as I mentioned in my little talk, that we can see this even worldwide with the idea of the Sorcerer's Apprentice, where the brooms go out of control and the water bearers go out of control, and how the Space Odyssey 20, again, Hal won't work cooperatively with the humans and so forth and so on. So it's a very widespread idea, although I think it gets manifest in particular ways. And one of the really striking things is that the Moche are all about this warrior regalia and weapons that are attacking humans. So it suggests that there was some very specific political situation that made them use that old myth and pull it out and rework it to relate to their particular situation, versus when those Highlanders were talking to Avila, the missionary, they were talking about their yamas and their grinding stones, because that was their world too.
I think in the Maya case too, there's lots of vigorous debate that happens about these scenes. I think in this particular case, there's general agreement that the scene is involved in this broader narrative about the Maize deity and his underwater journey towards what we call his resurrection. But there's still a lot that we don't know about all the different aspects of this narrative and how it appears on different vessels, and how this particular polity understood the scene or the narrative compared with others that were operating at the same time. So there's still a lot that we don't know. We don't know what kind of work this particular narrative was doing with, in the specific senses of it for this particular polity. And that does inspire a lot of debate, but I don't think that's a problem. I think it's good for us to be arguing about what this could possibly mean, because it just drives the search to learn more and learn all that we can before we kind of settle on something that we can agree upon.
What about in your field, David? Does everybody get along?
Everyone gets along. I think one of the interesting things, though, is, and it's been sort of instructive working on this project over a number of years now, where for the Greek imagery, we have a body of literature, a substantial, certainly not everything that was written, but we have the ancient texts, Euripides, Homer, and so on. And that has often shaped how people have approached then the imagery, to the point that it's, it doesn't happen anymore, but certainly a few decades ago, you would still find publications where a scholar would assert that the ancient painter had got the story wrong, that they had somehow misinterpreted or misunderstood, because it doesn't, what they show doesn't agree with what we see in, for example, Homer's Iliad, which, and again, it's something I hope a project like this can help push back against, that these painters were free to kind of tell these stories in the way that they chose to, the way that made them most compelling and dynamic. They were, these stories were malleable. There were certain things that always happened. Theseus will always defeat the Minotaur, for example, but there is scope to play and to vary, to heighten the comedy, heighten the tragedy, and to really, at least I hope with this exhibition and our discussion, to really highlight that these painted ceramics are part of that broader practice of storytelling, and that these tales can be tweaked and adjusted to a particular purpose. And so the squabbling that scholars might do is, dare I say, maybe a little misplaced sometimes.
What else is there to do?
That's right. There's a question: how much of the painted scenes were based on historical events versus mythical and religious subjects?
Yeah, I can say, like I mentioned this a little bit earlier, there are different polities and sites that were really interested in portraying historical events, and there were others that focused exclusively on supernatural events, like the Codex style. So it really depended on the particular place and how their ceramic style served their particular political aims. So there's a lot of variability there. I think I was going to go somewhere else with that, and I have lost my train of thought, but I'll come back to it if I think about it.
I think for the Moche, again and again, because we don't have written records, it's hard to tell. And I think most people would agree, most scholars would agree, that there are scenes that are clearly mythical. For example, in your exhibit, you have these I think aggressive beans, it says in the catalog, violent legumes, depictions of lima beans as little warriors running after people. Well, that clearly is not something that really happens, or only happens in one's dreams, or maybe when the world's turned upside down. So we have scenes that are clearly mythical, and then we have scenes that look like they could be historical, because all of the individuals shown in them appear to be humans, but we can't say for sure, because we don't have an anchor to throw out of the boat.
Yeah, the other thing, oh, sorry, David.
No, it's no
well, I still have the thought in my head. Another thing about supernatural versus historical, a lesson that I've learned working with the Maya, is that those two things are not necessarily distinct. That what can appear to be very supernatural or exclusively supernatural is also historical. It's also political. And where those lines are maybe very clear for us, at least for the Maya, those were not separate camps of things at all. Those were very much one and the same. So I think if we encounter across Mesoamerica scenes that look very supernatural to us, we should always keep in mind that that could also be very closely, intimately tied to something historical and political that was going on for the crafters of that work.
Right, exactly. And I think,
yeah.
Go on, Jeff.
Now, I think the same could be said for the Moche, sure.
Right. And likewise for the Greek, I think actually the depiction of these stories on the pots is a way of bringing these, what we would call maybe supernatural, into the experience of those who lived with them. And so this distinction we might want to see between sort of myth and reality is much more blurry, and an example actually that relates to Theseus that I often make reference to is that there's a point in, I think it's the 470s BCE, where some people find colossal bones, presumably animal or dinosaur, or what have you, and they bring them back to Athens and present them as the bones of Theseus, because Theseus was imagined as this great over life-size hero. And so you have a very tangible way of making myth real in a way, and there is a sort of back and forth. Equally, though, there are some scenes that are very explicitly rooted in daily life. Thinking about Greek vase painting, where we see scenes of the symposium, for example. At the same time, those scenes are often very non-specific. None of the figures are named. And it's been interesting in the exhibition to juxtapose those with some of the Maya vessels, for example, where very specific historical figures are depicted and in feast scenes and what seem to be sort of diplomatic embassies. So there is an incredibly broad conspectus, and that's, I think, what has made this project so fruitful, is this wide spectrum of iconography across all three fields. Looking at more good questions, let's have a look. Were the Moche and Maya Codex artisans part of a journeyman or guild? Were their skills passed down?
Most certainly, as far as we can use contemporary indigenous communities as an example, those kinds of skills were most certainly passed from one generation to the next through things like apprenticeships, not necessarily through family lines, although that could certainly have been the case too. With codex painting, I'm not sure. We have such little evidence of codices for the pre-conquest Maya, so we only have 4 codices that survive. But certainly in the scribe tradition more broadly, these would have been skills that would have probably been practiced in a sort of workshop setting where the masters, so-called masters, would have passed on those talents to the next generation, for sure.
I think we can only say for the Moche that we could just suppose that is the case, but we really don't know yet.
And in the case of the Greek, we sometimes see very clear evidence from inscriptions where a painter will sign and actually give the name of their father, who we also know to have been either a potter or painter. So in those cases, we do have very clear evidence of the skill and tradition being passed down through the family. There's a very good question, which again gets to the heart of many things we've been talking about. Do you think the capacity to write or have a written language influence the way events were portrayed on pottery?
That's a really interesting question, and one that I'd probably want to think about even more, because I'm thinking about Maya pottery, which does have this kind of more narrative, almost kind of linear structure that in some ways mimics how the glyphs might appear or be read on a pot. But certainly there are traditions from other time periods in the Maya area that are different and distinct, and even though they still had a writing system at that time, the pottery looks really different. But then there's other areas of Mesoamerica and other time periods as well that have different strategies. So they're more based on motifs rather than narratives. And it's a so-called more open system that might have been understood across wide regions. And so that is really linked to how they were also doing writing, where the writing isn't as tied to particular phonemes or syllables or even languages, but a more open system of motifs and symbols that would have been understood across a wide expanse of cultures and languages and regions as well. So maybe there is something to that there is some kind of connection between how they were writing and communicating in that way, and but probably also the audiences that would have received such pots. Because within this kind of elite context, the elite artists who are producing them for elites and royal nobility who would have been literate, not everybody in my society would have, likely. But there does seem to be some kind of connection there, so I'd like to think about that more.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we could have a whole session just on that question alone. you know, there's many an empire, including the Inca, for example, that didn't have writing, and yet they had the largest empire in the New World, you know, by the 16th century. Um, you could turn the question on its head for the Moche and say, is the fact that they didn't have writing influence how they uh, painted their pots? I think the answer is yes, because I think it's very narrational when they want it to be.
Right. And I think the imagery is a way of preserving and perpetuating and sharing those stories. And
Exactly.
again, thinking for the Greek material, you know, I made reference to Homer, to Euripides, and so forth. But at the time, even in the 5th century, you know, writing is still a relatively new technology, and somewhat like sort of, you know, being savvy with being online and the internet. There's a whole spectrum of abilities, and we see this, you know, on the pots themselves, where we have some figures might be labeled and inscriptions, and the names are well spelt, and then there are plenty of others where the inscriptions are seemingly an incoherent jumble of letters. And I think the same is true on some of the Maya vessels, where we have glyphs that don't seem necessarily to mean anything. So there's a whole spectrum, both from the potter and painter side, but then also the people using these, and actually what they were, you know, were they able to even read extensively, or, you know, was it just a sort of functional level, and what they knew what they needed to read to get by? But it's very much through the sharing of stories, and I think that the oral tradition that all three of us are sort of looking at exists side by side. The imagery, and in some cases the writing, and there is, I think, a much broader sort of spectrum of ability. But I'm really glad that question came up, because it's one that sort of, I hope, really wanted this project to kind of dig into. I know we are running a little over time. We've maybe got time for one or two more questions. One attendee has asked about the Greek vase that ended up in Italy. How far did these vessels typically travel around the time that they were made? Did they mostly stay local, or are they found far afield? I can answer. I mean, for the Greek material, some of it stays locally, some of it stays in Athens or in Greece, but a lot of it does actually seem to be made explicitly for export. We have instances where potters are actually producing shapes that are particular to a particular region and decorating them in either black figure or red figure, so really targeting particular foreign markets. And you find Greek vases all around the Mediterranean, Northern Africa, into the ancient Near East too. Jeff or Ellie, so the distribution of some of these vessels, do you have any?
Yeah, I mentioned kind of earlier on that there are distinct styles that do seem to have been made for kind of wide distribution, or perhaps they were made to solidify political alliances. And so you find them outside of the smaller area where they would have been produced. And others, like the Codex style, that kind of archaeologically speaking, when you're finding and digging up fragments, they are mostly coming from the very sites that are producing them. So there do seem to be different strategies with production, gifting, distribution, still kind of within elite circles and circulating for elite audiences. But I should also mention that the art market loves these vessels, and unfortunately a lot have come into museum collections through black market collecting and looting, where we don't know the place where they would have ultimately been deposited. We don't know, very likely it came out of a burial, but we don't know for sure where that final resting place was, and if it was different from where it was ultimately produced. So unfortunately, for a lot of cases, that aspect of the vessel's life is inaccessible to us today. But for those archaeological cases, we can see that there do seem to be some differences in these distribution strategies.
Moche vessels seem to be fairly insular. They seem to have they may have traded vessels, you know, really fine ones among elite groups back and forth, but that really doesn't seem to be the case. And certainly outside of, there were other cultures in Peru at the time, very exciting ones, like the Nazca on the south coast of Peru, which is made their own pottery in multiple colors, compared to the Moche, which tended to use usually just two colors. There's some evidence of occasional influences that someone, maybe they were traveling and picked up some ideas. Later in Moche times, at the time, the vessel that is on this, these three vessels shown on the screen right now, was made. They were starting to be influenced from outside the Moche area into it, but not a lot the other way.
Thank you both. I'm just again scrutinizing the clock, and then say we've overrun our hour. Thank you everyone for submitting your questions. I apologize to those of you for whom we've not been able to answer your questions. We will try after the broadcast to follow up as best we can. We've been delighted to have such a engaged and interested and productive set of questions that, as I really, I think, fed into so many of the themes that the three of us wanted to explore today. I'd like to thank greatly Alice and Jeff for not only their contribution today, their participation, but throughout this project, their support, sage advice and counsel and encouragement as we've undertaken this project. And it's been a pleasure to work with them and to have the opportunity to share some of that with all of you watching today. For those of you in and around Los Angeles or planning to visit, I encourage you to come and see the exhibition at the Getty Villa, which runs until the end of July 29th, and you can plan your visit at getty.edu. With that, I'd like to thank you again all for watching, for taking the time out of your day to join us to explore these fascinating vessels and their imagery. And I look forward to further conversations as this exhibition runs. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.